This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm Dahlia Shendlin. Unfortunately, Gilad Halpern is not with us this week, but he'll be back next week. Every week, we bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and other things that we like and find fascinating. If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us because we're counting on you. I'm very excited today to welcome Batya Ungar-Sargon. She's the deputy opinion editor of Newsweek. Before that, she was the opinion editor of The Forward, the largest Jewish media outlet in America. She's written for many illustrious places, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Newsweek, of course, and the New York Review of Books Daily, and other publications. She's appeared many times on MSNBC, NBC, The Brian Lehrer Show, NPR, and other media outlets. She holds a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley in literature. Full disclosure, she's also commissioned and edited my own work at The Forward and now at Newsweek. We'll be discussing Batya's new book, Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy, published by Encounter Books, which will be released on October 26th. Batya, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Dahlia. It's so thrilling to be here with you.
Great to have you. I should say also, you're speaking to us from New York today. Is that right?
Yes, that is.
Okay. Let's start with the basic premise of the book. It's a media critique. You're arguing that the national media in the U.S. Has leveraged racial wokeness to obfuscate the class divides that actually truly polarize American society. And I wonder, at times it seems sometimes like your primary argument is, in fact, with the woke culture itself. Which is the more problematic issue for democracy, woke culture or the media?
Wow, what a great question. I definitely see the media as part of a larger trend, part of larger sort of pressure structures in America, a larger movement on the left and among liberals that has resulted in the abandonment of the working class. And so I would say the primary problem is income inequality in America and the class chasm that has opened up that nobody's willing to talk about. And the media has sort of become the handmaiden of that larger problem, I would say.
That's a very succinct way of putting it. One of the things I think is really interesting about the book is how you trace the historic roots of some of the national print media's shift from what was once a more working class outlook to an upper middle class elite. Can you give us a quick rundown of a very rich history?
Yeah, journalism used to be a working class trade, really. I still think it's not something you can teach people. I don't think people are learning journalism when they go to journalism school. They're establishing networks and contacts, which you need to succeed today because it's such a cutthroat environment. But, the work of being a good journalist is learning how to listen, learning how to challenge your priors. And that is certainly not something that's being taught at America's elite institutions these days. And so the heroes of the book that I start out with are Joseph Pulitzer and Benjamin Day, these two historic figures from the 19th century who believed that journalism should be for and by the working class, that it should be a crusade on behalf of the poor. And the way that I think about it is, we hear a lot about the partisan divide in America and about how our media is partisan. The problem with our media is not that it's partisan, it's who it's partisan for. You have Republican conservative media that's partisan on behalf of the rich who are conservative, and then you have liberal media that is now partisan on behalf of an affluent liberal elite as well. And you have no one who's partisan for the 90% of Americans who do not belong in either of those categories. And so to me, that's really the problem is, journalists have undergone this status revolution over the 20th century that put them in the elites, and that's who they now speak to.
Well, it's very interesting because given how critical you are of the left, some people might think you're conservative yourself. But I read into the book, especially the way you just described it, almost a Marxist critique. You're saying really what's at stake here is a class problem, and the identity politics aspect of it is being manipulated. Let's say it's become the opium of the 21st century, if I understand your perspective. Is that right? Is that wrong?
I am not afraid of being called a conservative. I am a socialist, and you're right that I have a Marxist view of what ails America right now, although I don't think that purely materialist solutions will solve what the real source of our problem, which is the loss of a concept of the common good and the loss of the idea of the body politic and why that matters, which as Jews, of course, like without the body politic, we're totally lost. That was Arendt's whole point. So I would say if people want to call me a conservative socialist, I'm not insulted by that. I don't fear being called conservative, but I would say that my views on economics are pretty radical. And my problem with the left is that it has abandoned an economic platform in favor of an identity platform that I think really perpetuates inequality because it allows them to act like it's not happening.
Yeah, I mean, that is certainly something that appears within the book. And at times, I actually thought that a lot of the criticism or the evolution that you describe in the media can really be attributed to capitalism itself. So is this really a problem of journalists and editors and publishers going astray? I mean, even those founding fathers, if you will, of the low-cost penny press, let's say, in the 19th century, they were also trying to make money. They weren't exactly a nonprofit endeavor. Is this really just a problem with American capitalism?
So my answer to this is not going to be satisfying. My own critique of capitalism has been moderated by spending time and interviewing and talking to working class Americans who are big proponents of capitalism. You know, the whole sort of tax the rich, that's not how they see things. They think rich people are jobs creators. And, you know, there's evidence on both sides of that. And so my primary point of view is we should be listening to the most vulnerable. We should be listening to poor and working class and middle class, the disappearing middle class of America, and asking them what they want. And so to them, you know, what goes by socialism is not always the most popular, although you also see things like Florida, which really went very strongly for Trump, voting to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. So things are much more complicated in America, I think, than they are even in other places. To your question, I would say the great awakening in American media, which actually started before Trump, was very much a digital media phenomenon. So journalists have always been liberals. They've always seen themselves as being sort of on the side of the little guy. But there was a countervailing force to their liberalism back in the day because their boss would be the head of a corporation, which meant that their boss was probably a Republican. Or you would have a newspaper and there would be one newspaper in this town and the town would be half Republican and half Democrats. And so the journalism had to be sort of middle of the road. Now, what ended up happening over the last 20 years, in large part because of the internet, was that you had the sort of collapse of local journalism, the local newspaper industry. And so journalists now live not just in very liberal areas, but in the most liberal areas in America. And with that sequestering, you also had the pressures of digital media, which measures success based on engagement. And you know this as somebody who works for the internet. The way that
I don't work for the internet, but we all work on the internet.
Yes, someone who writes for the internet is what I meant to say, is that the way that you that newspapers judge success is by how much engagement an article or a story creates, how many Facebook likes, how many shares, how many comments. And we know that the most engaged people are the most extreme people. So if you have a paper like the New York Times that's targeting a liberal audience, they're going to be shaped by the most extreme people who are in their readership because they are going to be engaging the most online. And that's going to give you a sense of what they want to see. And the problem is that we lost that countervailing force. So it used to be, journalists were pulling, to the left, and corporations and the business side was pulling to the center or to the right. And so you met kind of in the middle. What you have now is everyone is pulling to the left, the business side, the corporations, and the journalists themselves, who of course want to see their stories go viral. And so you know who you're pleasing in order to make that happen, right? They want to see their stories getting retweeted by AOC and by big influencers and so forth. And so all of the pressures now are pulling towards this much more extreme place. But of course, it's only extreme in terms of identity, not in terms of economics, the way I would want to see it.
Well, that's what I want to ask you. I mean, usually race and in many other countries, ethnicity, for example, or minorities go so hand in hand with economic status or deprivation or being on the top level of economic status. So can you really extract these? I mean, that's the whole argument about intersectionality, that race and economic status and other forms of oppression overlap. I mean, do you really think that the media has been focusing, or the liberal media, I should say, particularly on race to the exclusion of dealing with economic issues?
So I'm not a fan of intersectionality because I think
you don't
that
say.
But maybe for a reason that will surprise you, I think it's a betrayal of the descendants of slaves in America. I mean, our problems around race are very specific. We have a abandoned a very specific population. We have treated a very specific population in a way that has led to intergenerational poverty that persists today. And the intersectional idea, like somehow the idea that where Black Americans are today, that is intertwined with like the gay struggle, right? Which is so much further along. Like, I mean, if you look at where that issue is today in America, to me, that is a real insult. And again, it's not just an insult, it's that it lets people off the hook. Like the intersectional idea that somehow Islamophobia and anti-Black racism and anti-immigrant sentiment are all interconnected means you don't actually have to solve the actual specific problems that I think are the most urgent problems in America today. So that would be my sort of critique of intersectionality more generally. To me, I would say to you, the answer to that is if you compare the views of white liberals with the views of Black Americans and Latino Americans, the people who the woke movement is supposed to be speaking for on behalf of, those populations are very conservative, and they're conservative on issues of identity as well. They don't speak about identity that way. They don't believe in a racial moral panic. They don't believe in getting rid of high achieving classes in schools because certain populations are not performing. They believe in helping those kids perform better, right? So I would say to you, the way we know that class and race have been teased apart by the far left is by looking at working class people of color who don't support that woke platform at all.
But they do vote Democrat. And I think there is quite an overlap in, when I'm reading your book, it's hard to separate, for example, media from party trends and party politics. Is there an overlap there?
No, I absolutely think that is true. I talk a little bit about that in the last chapter, how, it used to be in America that you had two parties. You had the party of the working class and the poor, right, which were the Democrats, and then you had the party of the rich, which were the Republicans. And today what we have is we have a party of the rich, which are the Republicans, and then we have a party of the rich educated, which are the Democrats. Basically, every single plank of the Democratic platform today is very much geared towards a very specific elite. And I'm talking about everything. Like if you look at their platform on crime, if you look at the platform on environmentalism, immigration, unions, all of this is geared very much towards how the elite college educated see things and away from where working class interests lie. It's definitely a party problem.
There's an interesting way in which you don't exactly let the conservative media off the hook either. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a central part of your book, but there were points where you state, for example, that Fox News had an opportunity to create a political constituency of the working class, but instead, and I'm quoting you, you write, quote, "The channel went all in on the cultural wars, abandoning the working class's economic interests entirely to unite rich and poor conservative Americans around a cultural front without threatening the status of its rich viewership." So it seems like you have a mirror image critique. Is it a mirror image, or do you blame the liberal media more than the conservative media? Could you have written the opposite book also about the conservative media?
To me, conservative media, the difference between liberal and conservative media is very much about aesthetics, and it's very much about class. So the conservative media is very much geared towards a working class audience in terms of its aesthetic. Everything on Fox News is geared towards a working class viewer in terms of the chyrons, in terms of the font, in terms of the appearance of the hosts. It's very much the aesthetics of working class culture. And I watch Fox News and CNN all day long. I have them up on two screens just to follow where the conversation is going. You look at CNN, and what CNN is doing is it's geared towards that college educated viewer. And you can see this in the demographics, right? So only 25% of Fox's viewers have a college degree. It's over 50% of CNN's do. So there's very much a class element there that you see sort of really developing. I do think that it is terrible that they abandoned the working class's economic platform. I agree with you. There is a sort of commensurate critique there, but at least they don't insult their values while they abandon them economically, which is what the left has done and what the Democrats have done. Insulting them, insulting their religion, insulting their attachments, insulting that's really, to my mind, what led to Donald Trump is that same feeling that, you guys have this in Israel, where why would working class Mizrahim vote for for Bibi Netanyahu, what is he doing for them? Well, they felt that the same people who hated him hate them. The same people who go after him and have contempt for him have contempt for them. And it was a very similar thing. So the way that I think about it is, yeah, it's true. Both parties, both types of media have abandoned the working class, but only one of them sneers at them while doing it and calls them racists while doing it. And that's the left side of it.
And this raises so many questions. Is there really an aesthetic, a visual aesthetic that appeals more to conservatives versus liberals that you can see on TV?
I think so. Don't you?
I'm asking you. You're the one who studied it.
Well, I mean, as a person who belongs to the class that I am critiquing, right, I can tell the difference between, I'll give you an example. There's my car is insured by a company called Geico. And the ads that I get for Geico when I'm watching a Hulu television show and the ads I get for Geico when I'm driving in my car and listen to the radio are very, very different. And they are different in exactly who that humor is geared towards. Like, is the joke for somebody who has that kind of very ironic, post-secondary school, like having gone to gotten a graduate degree sense of humor that like the left and the liberals traffic in? Or is it a much more straightforward kind of, a pun that would seem super obvious to somebody like us, but it's clearly geared towards a different kind of listenership? I totally think you can see these things. Right. Yeah, for sure.
I mean, there's one point in your book where you refer to American conservative talk show radio, and you say that this is much more accessible to people who have to work with their hands, so they can listen to this kind of radio. And I thought to myself, can't they also listen to NPR? Not that I care if they do or don't, but I wasn't sure if I got the distinction, for example, on the radio thing. You're saying there's an obvious set of codes, whether it's radio or television, that people understand is geared towards them or against them.
Yeah, well, so I'll give you an example. MSNBC, okay? So in 2012, they were like Fox. Only 25% of their viewers had a college degree. Today, it's over 50, like CNN. Like, so what happened? What changed, right? How did that's a very stark, for 12 years to have lost 25% of working class viewers, which to my mind means working class liberals have very few media outlets, right? Like, who are they supposed to go for? But I mean, that to me is sort of the answer to the question. Like, they clearly figured out like how to sort of lean into a college educated viewer. And I think if you watch it, it's very clear how they did that.
Is this a global problem, or is it particularly an American story?
I get asked this a lot. So people, I get reached, journalists from France and from Denmark reach out to me and they say like, we see the woke language in our media. Is this coming for us? And what I say to them is, I could be wrong, okay? And I will be proven right or wrong in a couple of years. My thesis is that wokeness is a smokescreen for class and income inequality. So in America, we have disgusting levels of income inequality. And that's why woke media became so mainstream, because it acts as an alibi for elite liberals to not have to share their wealth, to not have to actually solve this like class chasm that's opened in America. So to the extent that another country has a similar problem with inequality, they will see a similar version of wokeness taking over. To my mind, France and Denmark don't have these problems. So I would be surprised if it took, my book will be wrong if it takes over to the same extent that it did in America. And that might be true.
Yeah. On the other hand, class divide is nothing new in America, right? America's generally been an unequal society, certainly for the last century. Do you think that the media is a cause of that?
I think that the media's abandonment of the working class enabled both Democrats and Republicans to lean into the globalization, to lean into the outsourcing of jobs, to lean into things like NAFTA and normalizing trade relations with China that actually resulted in the extreme downward mobility that we're seeing today. That, you're right, there has always been income inequality, but, in the post-war era from the 50s through the 70s, there was a huge amount of economic mobility for working class Americans. The middle class was extremely stable. It was sort of the opposite of what we have today. You had a very stable and growing working class, middle class, and huge amounts of social mobility. Today, what you have is essentially, a top 10% that owns 50% of the GDP. And it's essentially, we're approaching an oligarchy. And that's why, the title of my book is How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy, because to me, an oligarchy is really the opposite of a democracy. And that's what we're approaching with the help of the media, as you say. Yeah.
As you say, I'm just wondering. Really, because reading your book made me read the media differently for the days that I was reading your book, right? I was sort of reading the media, thinking, where does this where do I have a new critique of what I'm reading now? But then there's things like just a couple days ago, I noticed a column by the longtime New York Times columnist Charles Blow, which was entitled Writing for the Poor. And he reminded readers that he grew up in a family scraping by, no fancy prep schools, no Ivy League. He said, I grew up with a sense of being the world's most disposable people because you had little money and wielded little power. And he said, my job is to make sure people like his poor aunt who died in poverty are seen and heard. He said, when I write, I often consider how I would explain something to the old people I grew up around, all of them poor. And it just made me wonder, is he an example that, one exception to your thesis, or could he be an example of media outlets being a little more aware of the problem and bringing it back in?
So I'm very thrilled to say that over the last few weeks, I've seen the New York Times very clearly taking stock of what has been a huge mistake in the last 2 years, in the last 5 years, in the last 10 years. Charles Blow has been, I think, one of the biggest malefactors in the woke media, but they hired, for example, John McWhorter, which was like shocking and staggering and wonderful and clearly a sign of course correction. Charles Blow, after Donald Trump got record numbers of votes from, Black men, he got 18% of Black men, Latinos, he got 40% of Latinos, he got a third of Muslims. In the wake of that, Charles Blow wrote a column, instead of saying like, I wonder what it is that has made these people vote for the person I said was the biggest white supremacist in America since, George Wallace or whatever. Instead of asking that question, going to those people, interviewing them, finding out, he just said, oh, they are the handmaidens of white supremacy. That was his analysis, was like, sometimes people of color become the handmaidens of white supremacy. And I would say that I think he's being, the handmaiden of income inequality. The idea that racism is the biggest threat to America or is the big divide in America, I think is just completely fallacious. And so why has it taken off so much? It's because it is providing an alibi for highly educated liberal elites to not focus on the actual real problem, which is this class chasm, which, yes, Charles Blow is right. There are working class Black people, poor Black people who are suffering from this. In fact, perhaps most of all. But this intense focus on white supremacy to me is such a red herring.
But surely you don't think it's intentional. Or do you think it's intentional that they are purposely trying to perpetuate a liberal oligarchy, as you say? I mean, after all, these categories aren't entirely static. There is some social mobility in America, as difficult as it is. To what extent do you think this is kind of a mindset? Let's now perpetuate our liberal elite status.
No, I mean, that's a critique that I wish you would call me on the phone and tell me every single day, because to the thing that is one has to keep in mind is that everyone thinks that they're just doing the right thing and they're just trying to help, like everyone, and that is something that I really, of course, I struggle with, because I think the impact of the media's abandonment of the working class has been so astronomical and so horrific. But at the same time, you're totally right. Like, the pressures that led to this are much bigger than individual journalists. Although I think, the desire to be famous and the desire to be famous on social media and the desire to be rich, of course, is also there. But I totally take your point, and I think it's a really important critique. And I rely on my friends to say this to me every single day. Like, these people also think they're doing the right thing. I agree with you. I don't think it was intentional at all. And yet the impact has been severe and extreme, and we have to talk about it.
Okay, well, let's talk about what we do now. I mean, I think you do really illustrate the many myriad pressures coming from multiple directions on, for example, the individual journalist. And, you yourself, Dr. Ungar-Sargon, have abandoned academia, I guess, for journalism. So presumably you are trying to live out some version of rectifying what you see as a serious criticism. How could a journalist not be part of this? What could we do to improve the field? And since you have this critique yourself, how do you yourself try to, work in a different way and think in a different way?
When I was hired at Newsweek, I said I want one of my main focuses to be on elevating working class voices. So I think that's the one very, very important way is talk to people who have less than you. I mean, I'm religious, so I believe that, the least among us have the most to teach us. But, bring that into your journalism. Don't talk down to people. Don't assume you know what's right for people. Don't tell Black people who vote for a moderate instead of a progressive that they're low-income voters or whatever. Listen to the needs of their community. Don't turn away from things like crime. Don't turn away from the poor, from victims. And I would say the second most important thing is the thing that really has amplified this is the demonization of the other side. And again, it comes back to being called a conservative, like I'll have people use that as an insult against me, or I'll have, people say, aren't you worried to be seen as no, don't worry about, that's not a bad word. Like, be strong in who you are, but be a soldier in the war against dehumanization. Like, that is the thing that has enabled this to happen. In other countries, look what happened in Israel, right? You have this amazing government that's made up of people who were like literally enemies, right? But who came together because they had a common cause that was greater than their previous fights, right?
Just, you mean the current government?
Yeah.
Okay.
And you could, in America, like what people like me were hoping for was a realignment where you would have right-wing populists and left-wing populists sort of coming together and making common cause. But instead, the left-wing populists, they insisted on having this huge opposition to Trump with every fiber of their being. I don't know why. And now the right-wing populists are insisting on having this like opposition to Biden with every fiber of their being, even when he does things they agree with. And so you had these guys who, when Trump was sort of negotiating the withdrawal from Afghanistan, they were his cheerleaders. And then the minute Trump didn't have the guts to do it, Biden actually did it, and they turned on him and started saying, impeach him. Like that kind of cravenness, it's just so inexcusable. And I think you see that among journalists who are intolerant, who are snitches, who are out there getting their colleagues fired for publishing an op-ed by somebody they disagree with. You know what I mean? Like, we can resist that in every moment by being good people who do not participate in the dehumanization of those we disagree with.
Okay, I think that opens up a huge question about whether there are red lines. When you say you don't know why they were constantly angry at Trump, I think that's probably a road that would take us to a whole separate episode. But I do think that there was something that you wrote about how this change could take place. In the spirit of your book, that there is an obfuscation going on, a kind of alibi, using racial issues and critical race theory so as not to deal with the economic issues. I want to quote you again. Your book is simply very quotable, I would like to say.
Oh, I love
yes,
that.
It really
Thank
is.
You.
You say that they took the guilt they should have felt about their economic good fortune and political power, which they could have shared with the less fortunate had they cared to. And I actually didn't know what that referred to. Did it mean what you're saying now, just listening more carefully and more respectfully and compassionately, or did it mean giving direct charity? I mean, aren't most of them voting for the Democratic Party, which essentially supports things like affirmative action, even giving up their own positions or openings in fancy universities to the less privileged classes? So I wasn't sure what that referred to. How could they share their good fortune?
So it's very interesting. Again, it comes back to how, the weird nature of America. For liberal elites, there is this sense of like, that they're very willing to pay more in taxes as long as they can keep accumulating. I mean, that's the thing with like the tech oligarchs, for example, right? You tell them to pay a 60% tax bracket. They're totally happy to do it because they already are making so much more money than they could possibly ever spend. And those guys are voting for Democrats, right? Like, Wall Street gave more money to Joe Biden than they did to Donald Trump. And it's not because, they feel good about redistribution. It's because they felt they didn't have to worry about it. Now, it happens to be they were wrong about Joe Biden, who's doing an incredible job, I think. But so I would say, to your point, I think that there are larger forces at stake here. There's a larger point here where we have allowed ourselves to buy into a narrative that gives cover. And the way that it does that specifically is, Christopher Lasch made this point about 30 years ago. He said, the meritocracy depends on the top tier being racially diverse and diverse from a gender point of view. Because if it's all white men, it's very clear that it's not meritocratic. Right?
30 years ago, he said that, and it's just happening really in recent years, the diversification of the top.
So the top must be diversified. It is a huge problem that our elites are so white. Okay, that is a huge problem. Our newsrooms are incredibly white. It is embarrassing. And that is a real problem. But diversifying the elites, I mean, what happens to everybody else? I mean, that's sort of my real question here. So yes, I want to see a more elite, more diverse elite. Like, I want to see Black people getting rich. I want to see Latino people getting rich. I want to see people of color on the board of every corporation. Like, that stuff is important. But to me, the way that corporations have latched onto it, Amazon is not going to do anything that's not good for Amazon. So when Amazon puts up a Black Lives Matter sign, right, that is totally compatible with its anti-working class policies, right? That is not a threat to them. And I would say that, yes, of course, journalists see themselves as good people. Of course, they want to help the working class, but that is the same thing to me. Those things really go together very, very well. Like the New York Times didn't suddenly decide to start sharing power, right? If they're on the woke train, it's because it does not entail sharing power. That's sort of what I wish more journalists would understand. And to me, what's so funny is if you say this, it's leftists who yell at you, but it's like, this is such a lefty point of view, right? Like it's such a, what about everybody else? Yes, I want every budding Einstein in a low income minority community to have the chance to become Einstein. That is so crucial, both for America and for them. But what about everybody else? I don't think it's fair for everybody else to just be left behind. I think that's what I would say is why is that not a left-wing point of view?
And what would it look like if it was more incorporated into American media today?
I'll give you an example. Covering crime. Like every single day that a child is killed in public housing, like having a swarm of reporters out there demanding to know what happened, how did this happen, who's responsible for it, that never happens, right? You never see that. Baltimore's school children, 41% of them have a 1.0 GPA. That is unacceptable, but nobody cares. They could not care. Why are they not being swarmed with journalists saying, how are you allowing these children to just have no future? 84% of juvenile offenders are functionally illiterate. Like, why are the liberals just okay with that? And this is in liberal schools. Liberal school districts the Northeast is the most segregated, way more than the South. And we sit here calling the South racist, and we won't let Black kids go to school with our kids. I mean, and this is never covered, never spoken about. And if you bring this up, you get totally ratioed on Twitter. I mean, nobody wants to talk about this stuff.
Well, that I have no disagreement with you there, because I grew up in New York City public schools, and I experienced that every day. And I was very frustrated by the hypocrisy of blaming the South, even as a teenager in the 1980s. So I'm with you on that. It reminds me of Jonathan Kozol's kind of general crusade when, back when he was writing books, I guess in the 90s. And that was really his big issue, is bringing everyday urban poverty of America to the forefront of consciousness. And so you think maybe more newspapers should look like that. And this is why I'm trying to clarify this, because your critique of the elite media and their aesthetic and their language and their, insider jokes made me wonder if what you were advocating was simply dumbing them down. But I was sure that wasn't what you meant. But I'm asking you.
I mean, so that from our point of view, when you watch Fox News, a lot of it feels dumbed down. And that's because those people are not educated in the way that we are. But I think it's disgusting that we live in these I live in a working class neighborhood, but that somehow that the liberal elites have allowed themselves to be totally sequestered from people who are less educated than them. You don't have to always talk like you're for every media outlet to be going for the same, makes over $150,000 a year, has a graduate degree, lives on the Upper West Side. Like that's who all media is now geared towards,
All media?
The vast majority of liberal media now, that is where the digital pressure is pushing them towards, right? And so, first of all, why are you not catering at all? You've made it impossible for working class people to consume your media, for Trump supporters to consume your media. Why would you write about the news in a way that 75 million of your country folk would literally not be able to read it because it's so insulting to them?
Well, only because after reading your book, I looked up some of the stats and found out that 41% of America, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is a professional class, and that's 65 million people. I mean, there is a tension, because don't they also deserve to read in a language and conceptual world that they appreciate?
You know what, Aya, I totally think if liberals were look, it's in our economic interest to have open borders. It's in our economic interest to pursue this or that policy. It's in our economic interest to have media like the New York Times. Leave us alone. We want to be in our economic interest. I would be Gesundheit, right? Oh my God, totally, be my guest. But what they do is they have clothed their economic interests as a fight for racial justice. And that is the thing that I absolutely cannot abide, is acting as though you're standing up for poor Black people and poor Latino people, for the actually vulnerable, clothing pursuit of your own economic interests as an elite, clothing that up as social justice. I cannot stand that. That, I think, is the thing that really needs to be called out.
Okay, well, I have one last question. I mean, I have many last questions, but I'll try to limit myself to one, which is, when you make a very strong case, I think, for changing simply how we think about the other side, whatever, in this very polarized, dangerously polarized world in America right now, certainly in America, of listening more compassionately, without judging, really trying to hear, understand, open ourselves up, not sequestering. I agree with all of that. Do you think the other side of that divide, the populist group, you do say this is a populist critique. Do you think that they're having the same conversation and saying, listen with more compassion, understand why some of the things we're saying feel so painful, so, racist or insulting and offensive to the values that the elite side believe in?
Okay, so the question is,
are they having this conversation too? Yeah.
Who's they? Who's they?
I think in your book you do lump together a little bit conservatives and the working class, even though you say there is also a liberal working class. But anybody who's alienated by the liberal media in your critique.
So first of all, you could go to the South and find churches where there are Black and white working class people who are praying together. And all of the Black people voted for Joe Biden and all of the white people voted for Trump. And it's just not an issue. Like, the idea of deplatforming the other side is very much an elite liberal phenomenon. And it's so funny because it used to be the conservatives who stood for censorship, right? Who are like, you can't say this and you can't say that. And that's treasonous and that's not patriotic and that's blasphemy and da-da-da-da. And today, somehow, it's conservatives who are like, I just want to make an off-color joke. Like, what's the big problem? And it's liberals who are like, to the gulag with you, like, no one's allowed to not only make off-color jokes, but to say anything that is to say that there's a difference between men and women, right? That's now considered to be an act of heresy, right? It's like this very extreme policing of language. So there's been this total shift. But look, I'm not arguing that every working class person in America is the most tolerant person of all. What I am saying is we are the educated people. We are the people who run things. We are the people in the positions of power. We are the people making the money. And we are the people who wanted to be in charge, right? So there is more of a responsibility at that point when you have a job as an editor at a publication, let's say like I do, right? And when you're somebody who's, a lineman, right? Like, we do have more of a responsibility because we asked for it.
A lot of provocative and strong points in this book, Batya. I really appreciate talking to you about this. This is Dr. Batya Ungar-Sargon talking with us about her book, Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy, which will be released on October 26th. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. And I will just say one more thing, which is that there's a section in there about how anti-Zionism fits into all of this, which might be of interest to your listeners.
Absolutely will be of interest to our listeners. And thanks to Itai Shelem, manager of TLV1 Studios, and to Roy Shelem for producing this show, and to our producer, Ariel Cohen. Now, a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. And we take all kinds of views, so you can write us a critical review, too. You can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. We have close to 750 interviews. Like us on Facebook, follow me and Gilad on Twitter, or the Tel Aviv Review on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.